Warm welcome to Berlinale Talents. A warm welcome once again here in the How-To. It's great to see you this afternoon. As you all know, and as you can all see, we have a space topic this year, space discovery. So we are working on cinematic space in the widest way you can imagine. And today I have the pleasure, and in a minute you will be introduced to them immediately by the moderator, to invite you to another session that tackles the issue also in close relation to architecture. So please give a warm welcome to the moderator of the show. It's Toby Ashraf. Thank you very much for joining us. And
thanks for inviting me. Thank you everyone for coming. I just wanted to make clear that you could ask questions or pose comments while we are talking. Let's not make this, we don't have this big structure that is set. If there's anything you want to know more about, just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. I just would like to introduce Joanna Hogg and Matthias Sauerbruch to you first, and then talk a little bit about architecture and space as mirrored in one of Joanna Hogg's film, her latest exhibition. But maybe first to Joanna. Joanna was born in London. That's also the place where the house is set that we will talk about. She was very interested in arts like painting and other art forms before she came to film. Her first 88mm camera was borrowed to her by Derek Jarman, which I find a very sweet anecdote. Studied at the National School for Film and Television, also in London, I think, yeah. And made her first film called Caprice with no other than Tilda Swinton, a long-term friend, and then worked for a long time in television for Channel 4, and amongst other things, for example, did episodes of the EastEnders, until at one point she decided, now I want to make films, with a also very, I think, a fantastic quote, to do everything that I couldn't do in television. She's done 3 feature films, the last one of it being Exhibition, the first one in 2008 that premiered at the London Film Festival called Unrelated, the next one in 2010, Archipelago. And Exhibition came out here distributed through Fugu Films in last year in 2014, but I think it's 2013 that it was finished, right? Yeah. We will talk about the house made by James Melvin in her latest film, and we will also show you clips of Exhibition, of course. Matthias Sauerbruch was born in Constance, and together with Louisa Hutton, who's also in the audience over there, founded an architectural office in 1989 in London, and then moved in 1993 to Berlin. He studied here in Berlin, the Hochschule der Künste. His office became, or their office, better said, became very, very famous and successful in a short amount of time. They have around 70 employees right now, and if you're from Berlin, or if you're around Kreuzberg, you might know the GSW house. That also gives you an idea of maybe the style and the structure of the office, and colorful facades that would also be mirrored in the house by James Melvin that we're seeing now. Together with Louisa Hutton, he's also a guest professor at the University of Harvard, has been teaching at the Technische Universität, and has been, and I now have to look up the word, has done a conversion or update, as he says, to the house originally built in 1969 by James Melvin. Please give them a big welcome. I'm not sure all of you have seen the film Exhibition. If not, shame on you, you must, it's amazing. But just to have some visuals that we can talk about, maybe we can run the first clip and take it from there, so that we are both in the film and in the house. I think it's a very well chosen, not by us, but a very well chosen scene, because it exemplifies a few things. First of all, the performance of the people in the house, starting with a very physical performance, almost like a performance dance, and then the way that they perform in the house, but also the house performs on them. When we had an interview for the Tuts, I asked you how important the house was for the film, and your answer was everything. It's often described as a third character in many reviews, and maybe you can tell us how the house became everything for you, how it became a protagonist, and how you decided to make it a big part, or maybe the main part even, of that film.
I mean, it's a big question in a way, because I realized I was thinking a little bit before this talk, sort of preparing a bit in my mind, and I just realized that the sort of whole sort of concept of architecture in cinema, for me personally, is it's like a sort of deep, dark well. It's so complex. There's so much. It's so much a kind of part of my psyche in a way, and all my films kind of start with a place and usually a house. So it's true. It's sort of everything. I mean, to just sort of contextualize it a little bit. I mean, the house. I got to know the house through James Melvin, the architect, the original architect of the house who built it, as Toby said, in 1969. And he and his wife Elsa became friends, and I became, with my husband, friends with the house over the years. And then Matthias and Louisa came into the picture sort of later on in a way. After James and Elsa had, because they built the house for themselves after their children had grown up. So it was the house was sort of representing a kind of new lease of life for them in a way, that they were going to sort of be living there into their old age. But yes, just to go back to sort of the sort of ideas for the film. So I'm going to sort of cut it short in a way because it's too long a story. But anyway, the house became the focus of the film for me, and I realized that if I wasn't able to use that particular house to make this film, then I wasn't interested in making the film at all. That it wasn't about finding another location. It was just that it was sort of the essence of it, and so I sort of built everything, all my hopes, all my ideas and dreams for the film around this particular place. And really, in a way, to sort of depict how we become attached to the dwellings we live in, how we sort of are part of them in the sort of past, future, and present. And I wanted to sort of see the house as a container, in a way, for this couple. For those of you who haven't seen the film, it's a married couple, both artists who live in this house. And the story is really about how two artists can kind of exist within the sort of same working space and living space, really. So that yes, it had to be sort of the container for all these ideas, and then yes, it was about how this couple live in this space, and how the architecture dictates for them how they live in this place, how the house is in a way a kind of sort of dominant member of the family. Sort of forcing them to move and live in a certain way and interact in a certain way, and sort of imprinting on them really kind of so much of a kind of chunk of their lives, because they've lived in the house for 20 years in the story. So.
And you've seen the house both before and after the update, if I understand correctly, or only both.
Yes.
Maybe Matthias Sauerbruch, you can talk us a little bit through this. Now we know the backstory, that it's sort of, I think, if I interpret you right, it's a labor of love. It was a labor of love by Melvin, the building of the house, and how you came into the conversion of it, and maybe also go a little bit, because we have this wonderful color here already. I think this is your conversion, the color that also your office is famous for. How and why this film was it's a film also, but the house, I mean, was converted into something new and spectacular.
Well, we came in touch with this house through the clients who wanted to convert it, who asked us whether we wanted to get involved, and of course we did. It's because it's a very unusual building. It's in a relatively conservative part of London, and it stands out as one of the few modernist buildings.
It's in Kensington, right?
Yes. It's a freestanding. It's an area which has lots of terrace streets, basically, and then there's that corner side where the building is as a freestanding object, sitting in not a large plot, but in a plot large enough to have a garden around the building. So it's very unusual. And And it has all the kind of hallmarks of heroic modern architecture in a way. It has the transparency, it has the kind of minimalism, it has the kind of, well-proportioned materiality and all of these things. Except that when we got involved, it was on first sight, one could say it was relatively run down. I mean, there were a few materials that had deteriorated. Like, for example, on the ground floor, I remember there's a very large glass facade, where the glass had somehow gone white because, I don't know, maybe the seal had broken or something. And so, I mean, there were some obvious things that needed repair. And also it was very full. It had the kind of, the remainders, the memorabilia of a whole life in it, which was kind of, in retrospect, particularly after seeing your film, I mean, gains totally new importance for me now. But of course, when we got involved, it was clear that these original owners wanted to move out for private reasons, and a new couple wanted to move into this building with different needs, different tastes, different expectations, and they were purely on a kind of material and technical level. There were certain repairs to be done. And in terms of the spatial structure, our intervention is quite minimal. Actually, it's really the surfaces, the colors. We changed the nature of some of the surfaces. I mean, like the folding door that you just saw, the sliding door and so on, those were not sliding and not folding before. Changed the surfaces, the floors, and so on and so forth. But I mean, in general, we were trying to bring out the nature of the building that was already there.
Since this panel or this talk is called Room for Emotions, I also wonder, since you already brought up that it was an emotional, original construction of the house, what kind of emotions you actually have coming into the work of another architect and sort of like, converting it, but also rebuilding it. I don't want to say changing it so much, but in a way you are, with the color palette that we're going to talk about in a few moments. What was your initial idea or your feelings? Maybe this is too pathetic to talk about feelings in this context, but maybe you know what I'm getting at, to be working on someone else's work that actually was a labor of love.
I mean, if you're familiar with our work, you know that we're very often working with situations, particularly urban situations, that are somehow conceived by or somehow configured by history or by previous architects or circumstances. And rather than wanting to renew everything, reform or kind of eradicate what we find, we were always trying to find in a way the kind of latent qualities of the situation and try to bring those out in a kind of intelligent way. It's interesting. I think we have because Louise has worked with the Smithsons, and the Smithsons always saw themselves as a third generation of the Modernist. We are definitely fourth or fifth, I don't know, somewhere further down the line. And we always see ourselves as somehow the grandchildren of the Modernists, right? And I think our relationship to modern architecture is very much that of grandchildren to their grandparents, rather than, there's no need to try and prove yourself to be better than your parent, but you can start to rely back. And there's a sort of relatively relaxed relationship. And we never met James Melvin and his wife, but we met the building intensively, and we felt, in a way, like what you say. I mean, it's sort of not necessarily executing their will or something like that, but we were definitely trying to continue the story. We were trying to pick up and somehow build a tradition, if you like.
Maybe we could have as a visual the collage, or as you might say, mood board. Exactly. I'm using the word mood board, and I also had the slip of the tongue that I called the house the film, because this is not a usual architect's blueprint, but it's more like what film designers use to sort of like give a director in a bigger production, I would say, bigger budget production, an idea of the moods and the lights and the colors, the color palettes that are used in a film. And now you did this, what I find really interesting for the house, and maybe you can talk us through this very interesting collage and tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we made this drawing in order to try and capture. We try and do this with almost any project that we do. We try and make one drawing and try and capture in that one drawing somehow what we were trying to do. And it's for those of you who are not familiar with architectural plans or architectural drawings, it's a combination of a number of projections. So they're plans, which are horizontal sections. They're elevations, which are in the third dimension, kind of looking at things. And they're kind of various three-dimensional bits, like the staircases, the most obvious kind of axonometric or isometric elements, or the little lounge chairs and so on. And it's an attempt to use traditional architectural representation, which is parallel projection, but to combine it in such a way also with the textures and the colors that a story kind of emanates from the drawing. So it is, for us, it's more like a storyboard, if anything. And it is, as a matter of fact, but I mean, this is maybe also an afterthought now after Joanna's fantastic film. It's something of a filmic explanation of the house, a scenic explanation of the house, if you like. There is, of course, we borrowed techniques from whatever, collages from Art or Dege or whatever, that sort of generation of artists implying the simultaneity of several realities in one situation. I mean, but maybe I can add one thing. I mean, one of the big problems of architecture is in general to represent it. I mean, you cannot really represent. It always remains a kind of somehow not the architecture, not the space, but somehow a photograph or a drawing or something. And so here we're trying to experiment with the representation of architecture. But I think the most intriguing and the richest and most expanding also representation of architecture I've ever experienced is Joanna's film, actually. It's really, for me, it's about the house.
That's really nice because that sort of really connects, actually looking at your drawing, which I haven't seen for some time, with how I was trying to make the film, which was all these different realities being expressed at the same time. And the sort of because the sort of aspiration in that drawing. I mean, there's the sort of how somebody might live in that space, but it's also yes, I don't know, it's sort of this sort of future and present feeling. I mean, I in my other films, without going into any detail about them, I saw them as very linear, sort of in a way, kind of one level, and with exhibition. Like this drawing, I wanted to express the sort of dreams and kind of reality and memory as well, and I didn't really know how that was going to work out, except that the house was totally the inspiration, in that just walking into the space of the house gave ideas all the time. So for example, the pink sliding doors that Louisa and Matthias designed became like a theatre space, became like a sort of proscenium arch that moved. And yes, you sort of took you from one space into another space. So it was just a gift for the film, those pink doors, which were something Melvin hadn't thought of, those sort of divisions. So and then just the simple thing of being in the house and looking outside, and not only just looking outside into the garden, but seeing yourself or seeing the house reflected on the outside seems such a simple thing. But again, that set off a whole sort of train of thought, of ideas, and in terms of collaborating with the cinematographer, just how the film was going to be shot.
And it's really interesting that it's the first film where you don't really leave one location. You do leave the location at some points in exhibition, but it's fascinating that you say that a dreamy aspect, or like a mixed reality comes into play, because the scenes that play outside the house turn into some kind of like dream or nightmare performances as well. There's one scene where the two have a Q&A like we're having now about their relationship in a theater, and you're not prepared for this, but you realize that everything that's happening outside the house sort of seems to be, you know, of a shifting reality as well. And now that you already talked about how important architecture in your films is in general, maybe we can go back one film and have a film clip of Archipelago. That, like all films so far by Joanna Hogg, deals with the correlations, conflicts, relationships, interactions of family members in the broader sense, and that is in one way or another mirrored through rooms, spaces. In Archipelago, it is of course also the Isle of Scilly, which is an archipelago. It's like an island string, you might say, and there's nature is very predominant in the film, of course, the vast landscapes, but then also even more predominant as far as the psychology of the, if I may say so, psychology of the characters is concerned, are the rooms in them. And so maybe we can watch a little clip and then talk about, yeah, that. Was the architecture of the, maybe we'll see a clip of that later, but possibly not, was not set in the UK. It was in Tuscany. It was a holiday resort sort of that or a house that they owned that the family fled to. Maybe you can, as the clip is being prepared, lead us a little bit through the architecture in that film that we are not going to see now, and how that, yeah.
Well, very different architecture. It was a holiday house that you rent, and it was somewhere that I already had become familiar with, and I'd actually gone there to do a painting course of all things, and the house and the surrounding area really struck me. It's a house that sits on the edge of a motorway, but the motorway is only maybe, I don't know, about a distance is 1,000 meters, a very short bit of motorway that never became a proper motorway, and I was really attracted to this idea of this very tranquil house, but this sort of tension of this motorway running alongside it. So, and in fact, when I arrived on this painting holiday, it was my cousin organizing it. She was so ashamed and so embarrassed by the position of this motorway that she got the gardeners to mow the lawn as we arrived, so we didn't hear the cars on the motorway. She actually made it worse in a way. It sort of highlighted it more. But that, yeah, I sort of immediately thought, yes, this is somewhere I could set a story.
Is it fair to say then, if I see that you have a relation to that house and to the house and exhibition, that the personal relation to architecture and to space is sort of like the precondition for a cinematic idea?
Well, yes. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to sort of analyze it in myself. I think I'm always. I mean, we're all influenced by the architecture that we live in. I think I'm particularly attracted to modernist architecture because I grew up in a kind of semi sort of Georgian house, very very old house with creaky floorboards and tiny little staircases going up to little levels. Very very sort of complicated architecturally, and I think for me, I like very I do like sort of very clean, simple spaces, and I think somehow kind of. Yeah, modernism is attracted to me for that reason. But I mean, actually, maybe there won't be time to go into it. But I'd be quite interested to talk about how, sort of in Hollywood films, it's kind of an obvious thing in a way, but Hollywood films use modernist architecture to house their villains. It's always a kind of a drug dealer or a pawn king or a serial killer who lives in a modernist house. So in my film,
with a German accent normally.
It's true, actually. No, yeah.
So
the Hollywood villa I wanted to talk about this later, but also the thing you said, that this cliche about modernist architecture, that it's cold and that it's detaching, yes. And that it sort of like mirrors the soullessness of the character, which you kind of like completely subvert in your film.
Yes, well, I still have people respond to the film and say how sort of, cool as in cold, and how sort of distancing the house is for them, and also want to talk about money. And I decided that my characters I saw my characters actually, like Matthias described the house when he first encountered it. My characters bought the house when it was quite run down, and never saw the architecture as kind of aspirational architecture. They didn't see it as somewhere sort of glamorous to live. They saw it as something sort of quite functional and sort of linking modernism with the sort of political ideals that it was developed with. I mean, this is just sort of post-rationalizing in a way why my characters kind of move house, but the idea that that sort of in a way the house doesn't live up to the potential they thought it had, and now we're just obsessed with kind of interiors and lifestyle, and I mean, I think that's sort of quite interesting, and I sort of think about these ideas now, and in a way I wish I'd put more of that into the film. I always finish a film wanting to sort of do more that I didn't do, but it's sort of...
But I mean, I think now after you've made the film, actually, and you obviously make your viewers see the house in a totally different way, I somehow suspect that maybe the Melvins, not knowing them at all personally, but I somehow feel that they were possibly not living up to their house as well. I mean, because the house is, I mean, one has to explain, James Melvin is part of a partnership called GMW, which were in the 60s, were big in London and in the UK. And they're of the swinging 60s generation. I mean, they were part of this kind of liberation. And I'm sure that for them, building a house in a context that is totally Edwardian or Georgian or Victorian at best, maybe, in other words, lots of brick buildings with lots of ornaments and lots of bay windows and all
lots
of that.
Lots of tradition also.
Traditional context to place a kind of glass box, that was pretty much close to revolution at the time. And of course it's the house, and Joanna's film explores this in all its beauty and its painful aspects is totally transparent. I mean, it gives you the outside, the urban landscape as a stage. You're kind of looking into the city like you would be looking into a country, into a landscape. Like, I mean, famous glass houses like the Farnsworth House by Mies van der Rohe or something like this, they're set in the landscape normally. This is set in the middle of the city, so you're looking out into this urban landscape like you'd be looking into an 18th century painting, but also people are, of course, looking in, because at the moment you turn on the light and, then you become an object of voyeurism or interest, at least. And this, I think, is you have to want this. You have to be able to live this in a way. And the fact that these windows, the kind of huge window panes, when we came to the house, had whitened and were translucent, not transparent anymore. You couldn't really see in or out. In a way, maybe that was a way of protecting yourself. In a way, possibly maybe it's also to do with age, or I don't know. And also the way the house was filled up with plants, for example. Although there's a beautiful garden to look at outside, they had lots of plants in the room. And so in a way, the windows were screened off with plants in a way, so as to hide yourself almost. Yeah. So and I mean, this is what your film shows in such incredible clarity and beauty. This relationship between the inside and the outside is very, it's sort of demanding in this building, I think.
So yes, after your redesign, then it became much simpler. So then for the inhabitants, more exposing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sorry.
Can we maybe now see the clip go back to Archipelago? Sorry to interrupt this picture. It's turned into a good conversation.
This one's good. Fine, that's right.
What a very painful and yet very funny scene to watch. I think two aspects can be transferred to exhibition as well, and that is the aspect of class that sort of like comes in when the waitress comes in, you know, where you realize this is a class performance. And the other thing that also applies very much to, but much more linked to one piece of architecture, namely the house, is the stage. This is a stage. We were in a room, in a space, in a restaurant, and not only it's an open and social space, unlike the house that you reconstructed or reinvented in a way. But yeah, it does something to people, and there is an interaction there, whether they're aware of it or not. That, you know, the architecture, the space calls for a certain kind of behavior. You know, that you sort of like, I would say, personalize more in exhibition. But maybe you can tell me a little bit about, you know, that interest of that, you know, like maybe to break it down a little bit to make the architecture a protagonist. You know.
I mean, in the case of that scene, I saw that as a sort of dance. It's like, yes, again, as you say, it's sort of very theatrical. So I gave the actors the kind of space to work in. I didn't actually say which table they should end up in. So I sort of quite like the idea of this kind of space, this empty restaurant. And then I said to the mother, Patricia, I said, decide where you want to sit, but don't tell anyone where. So that the daughter has to guess where she's going to sit, and so it was quite a natural sort of dance in a way that happened. Yes, it was sort of setting the kind of arena, and then getting them to use the space. And I find yes, sort of the space and architecture is very important in that I like to see it, and I like to see my characters moving around in it. So we kept, as you can see, obviously the camera very fixed while they're moving around, so you can see the body language, because I think the architecture kind of, going back to your original points, you know, dictates their behavior. And going back to exhibition and H-house, as Louisa and Matthias call it, I was really interested in how my characters were going to move around in this space. And I got the actors to live there while we were filming, so that they would become very intimate and very familiar with the different spaces, so they would know how different ways you might walk up a spiral staircase. I mean, the spiral staircase is again, this sort of another kind of dictator. It's this house's dictator. The spiral staircase is actually quite cruel in a way, because you know, if you have a habit of going up and down a spiral staircase, you're sort of lopsided. You know, you're never. I don't think it's probably very good for you, very good for your knees. And I said to my my actors, or my non-actors, as the case was, you know, think of ways, rather like dances. I felt like I was sort of casting dances in a way. I sort of said, think of ways how you go up a spiral staircase, and a way of sort of evening out. You know, you can sort of go up backwards to sort of make sure you're not always sort of moving the same way. So there were sort of things like that were important. Well, this intimacy that they had with the place was very important. They needed to be able to open a cupboard and know what was inside, and so living there sort of you know, created that, and sort of created the story in a way. So it totally came out of the architecture.
And maybe now to go back to the update of the film, how much was that part of your plan originally? How much? I mean, now we have the perspective that Joanna Hogg sees the house as being updated by you, with the colors, with a different life, with a, you know, yeah, with a fresh tone, or with a, I don't know, yeah, update, as you say. How much did you reconstruct this in the thinking that this, you know, would sort of not maybe be a stage, but, you know, would dictate, to use your word, the way that people would move, and would move differently? Maybe you can tell me something about this.
Well, as I said, I mean, we were thinking that we were somehow executing the original intention of the building. In other words, we were, for example, as I said, we were reinstating the original transparency, and we were sort of like clearing out the clutter, if you like. I mean, not just furniture, but also trying to remove what seemed to us unnecessary detail and kind of reducing it to the bare minimum in a way, which of course, yes, made, as Joanna already remarked, I mean, made the whole floor, certainly the main living floor, more of a stage than it was before. If you consider the large glass screen that is leading out into the garden and the surrounding city, like a stage frame in a way. It was like where the action in a way would be happening. To be honest, I mean, I think the film opens your eyes. I mean, if you know the building very well as we do, I mean, I'd never seen it the way the film sees it. So you really learn something about this building by watching it. And what we had in mind at the time was more an atmosphere. We were trying to create a new type, a refreshed atmosphere, if you like. I mean, and the color is very much part of that. It's quite joyful, actually. It's quite energetic, and the materials, we were introducing more natural materials. There's beautiful stone, there's a kind of beautiful oak floor, for example, and so on. So, I mean, we were sort of trying to, I guess you could also describe it as a set, as a film set. I mean, we were trying to create surroundings for a life that one imagines. But of course, I didn't quite imagine it the way the film describes it.
Maybe I can already ask for the next scene of the performance scene, if you will, because we already talked about this.
It's, I mean, I don't know, maybe if you have to bridge another gap, just the scene that we've seen, for example, just now, where we saw the female actress, the female character kind of in her study, and you heard the rumbling noise. Now that's the chair, the rolling chair above in the studio of her husband. And of course, that sort of sound in a way indicates already what, for me, the film shows all the time, namely that I mean, you have this kind of physical or this kind of sensual experience. You hear something, and you could see this as a consoling, as a kind of comforting sound, because there's another person in the room, and you're very comfortable. You know, you love this person, you know this person well, you're kind of somehow safe. But at the same time, it's also the way it's framed in the film. It could also be a threat. I mean, it starts to be so noisy that it's intruding in your space, and it's somehow, you know, it's not just something that's slightly irritating. And the same, for me, could be said about many aspects of the house that on first sight are like positive and liberating and privilege and everything else, and then all of a sudden there's a sort of edge to them, the way Joanna shows them and presents them in the film, where you kind of wonder, you know, is it really as easy as I thought it was? Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, the first scene we saw, and I mean the idea of the detachment, because we're all a little too harmonious here. I think let's bring a little controversy in play. Is that, of course, you know, the idea of modernist architecture, you know, being the ultimate symbol of alienation, you know, being mirrored also in couples. In your film, they're communicating not verbally, but you know, they're via intercom, I think it's called, a little in-house sort of like walkie-talkie or telephone thing. Of course, it brings the physicality, I think, and the emotions on a level of, you know, physical detachment, I think, and also the fact that she hears him could be, you know, if you're in a relationship, a nice sign of, oh, I hear my husband, but it's also, you know, they're both artists in the film working, and how distracting and negative is that in a way. So maybe you can defend yourself in this, you know, pseudo attack on your architecture.
Well, but at the same time, you have to also see that they each have a space. You know, they each have the space to do whatever they like. So I mean, in a way, there are defined borders. You have the choice of opening and closing these, folding, sliding, and so on. So I mean, I think you can you can always see it as positive and negative at the same time, which I think is what makes it so interesting. I mean, because modern architecture normally is either seen as evil, I mean, described as, the Pawn King in Hollywood.
Cold.
Exactly, or kind of rational or machine-like or whatever. Or it's seen as this kind of resolution of all your problems, this kind of amazing sunlight flooding in, and it's all, free and open and a better future. And here we have something which is much more subtle, somewhere in between.
Although I feel, on some level, I failed to show the warmer side. I mean, I am trying to say that, but I think if I were to make the film again, and maybe this is interesting for those of you who are sort of making your own films and thinking about how to put them together, I think the big challenge with making the kind of cinema I'm interested in, which works on different levels, is actually communicating all those different levels. And I think, like you say, there's still this sort of alienation aspect that people see to the relationship, and I don't see it entirely. I mean, as Matthias says, there's sort of different shades, different subtleties, but I would sort of amp up the warmth if I was making that film again, because it's there in my own mind and in my own intentions. But I feel in the sort of finished film, I'm not sure if I sort of communicated that clearly enough. So so there's always this sort of kind of intention, ambition to make a film that kind of works on all these different complex levels, and maybe I've succeeded a little bit, but I think it's quite hard in 90 minutes or so to depict a living, breathing relationship, and I'm still interested to do that. I mean, I'm still interested in this kind of space to work in and depict this sort of modernist space, if we want to call it that. But I'm still interested in showing how a marriage operates. But I think there's so many steps further one can go.
But if the room for emotions is in questions in your film, one thing is not in question. That's what you could call the room for desire, because this is why I'd like to show the next clip now, and then maybe open it up to everyone else as well to ask your questions or pose your comments. In the film, well, you already described it. We have two characters who are nameless. That's D and H. And since the female character is sort of like left alone, or they're not physically with each other so much, she develops a sexual relationship to the house or its walls or its architecture in a sense. And I'm not really sure if that's extremely clear in the clip we're going to see now, but we see that there is a sort of interaction that personalizes or sexualizes the house, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that and then see what kind of feedback or communication comes. Kind of sums up a few things that we've talked about, the fact that she's not actually doing for a film camera or anything else, but actually for the theater stage that she is on being looked at. Maybe you can talk us a little bit through the idea of like bringing the sexuality into the film, and also like making the couple into a threesome, including the house, and then also maybe, Matthias Sauerbruch, you can tell us a little bit if the idea of sexuality was ever struck you ever in constructing the house, or if that is an aspect that is very foreign to you.
I mean, the idea of Dee, the wife, being in love with the house, I mean, I see it that she was always in love with the house, but it's when they start to bring in the reality of leaving this house, moving to somewhere else after 20 years being here, where the relationship has in a sense been formed alongside the relationship with the house. The relationship, in a way, you can't distinguish what's the house, what's the husband, what's the wife. I mean, they're all sort of part of the same relationship, but the wife, in a way, clings on to the house a bit more than the husband does, and is reluctant to sort of give it up, because the house contains so many memories, so many dreams that the couple have had. But I I was reading while making the film, actually. It was even sort of not before when I was writing, but I was reading during the making of the film about objectum sexuals who are people who believe that inanimate objects they find inanimate objects sexual. And in fact, I was saying to Toby earlier that these people who call sort of OS is kind of like a kind of another sexual orientation. They really believe that it should be considered like being gay or being lesbian to be an objectum sexual. I mean, it seems kind of strange, but actually, to me, not that strange. I'm wondering if I'm partly one of those people, because I become I do sometimes believe, I become very attached to certain objects in my life, and often it's places that I'm living in or have lived in, and you sort of believe that in some way they have a soul, that there is something alive about them. So I suppose it's close to the idea of sort of animism or something, but this whole territory I think is very interesting, and again I feel like I'm only just sort of breaking the surface of it in this film. Maybe that will come up in something else, but it's but that idea of sort of being sexually attracted to something inanimate just seemed to work with the story. But then I was also looking at performance art, because the main character, the wife, is a performance artist. So I was looking at the work of Valet Export, for example. So there were lots of different influences.
Is that idea completely foreign to you, or could you? I mean.
No, totally not. I mean, I think architects in total can probably be counted into the category of people that you were describing.
It's a collective coming out on this stage.
Otherwise, they couldn't spend so much time with what they're doing. And I mean, in this particular building, I mean, as I was saying at the beginning, we were sort of trying to reduce it to an essence, if you like, but at the same time, we were sort of trying to charge almost every aspect, every surface, every elevation, every piece of furniture. And if you look at the picture that's on one of Hélène Binet's photographs that's up on the screen, I mean, you can see there's the colored surfaces, and that in the foreground you see a shelf, which is kind of particular proportion that is somehow structuring the space in front of it, and far back in the far end you see a kind of stainless steel element. So I mean, it's like there are not many elements in the building, but every element somehow has a soul, I would say. As a matter of fact, I mean, it's I do also believe in sort of not quite animism, but I mean, in a way, somehow you can transfer energy into spaces, into buildings, into objects, which you can sense, And good architecture is full of good energy, if you like. So I mean, we were definitely trying to do that, and if you remember the drawing that was up on the stage, I mean, there was the kind of surfaces and materials that were chosen very deliberately. Like, for example, we were using a very rich hue veneer in the bedroom, which creates a fantastic atmosphere. And then there are some pieces by a London artist called Nick Turvey, who's made a fantastic curtain that is somehow reflecting light in a very particular way into the dark space. And he's also made some very beautiful lamp objects, which are sort of they're rusty steel oak leaves, right? Really big, like this, and they're, I mean, along with the sort of I guess clean space that we were proposing, they've gained enormous presence and persona in the space. So I think that the film, in a way, continues a story that. Deliberately or not, we were starting to set with the architecture, but it extends it far, way beyond it, the kind of obvious observation of what you see.
I mean, I suppose it's an interesting thing that you design a building or you design a space, but if it's a dwelling, then you're sort of letting go a bit when those people move into that space. They're going to bring in objects or sort of they're going to live in it in a way that might not necessarily be the way you would ideally want them to live. But yeah. I don't know.
In this particular case, because we knew the clients relatively well and somehow developed the whole project together, which happens almost with many clients, but in this particular case it was very constructive and somehow led the way. I think there was an almost unbroken continuity from the design phase into the living phase, if you like, and you can see that, I mean, in some of the images of the film very clearly.
Can we see more images in the meantime? That would be great. Please, and yeah, Roy, how do we do this do we have microphones? Yeah, can we? There's one and there. Yeah, 1, 2, 3.
Test. Okay. Thank you for presenting this work. I haven't seen the film, in fact, but I'm myself very interested in the connection between architecture and cinema, and in my work also. I'm a director and a filmmaker.
Let me quickly introduce you. It's Roy Dibb. His work, Spectacle of Privacy, is in the Forum Expanded exhibition, and it's also set in one specific space and deals with the inside and the outside, politically and privately.
Totally. So I will continue from this, because in fact, I have a comment and a question. My first comment is that I'm personally not interested in this. I will be a bit rush with this. But I'm not interested at all with this stupid representation of whatever Hollywood would give for this. I'm much more interested in to look to this in correspondence with Antonioni's work, for example, with modern architecture and the presence of the modern architecture in Antonioni, or even with Godard in Le Mépris, or such films. And I think that, though I don't know your film, but even from the two scenes that we saw now, our dealing with the modern architecture today, which is a big failure, that is based on the idea that at some point you mentioned that the glass was in fact protecting people from being exposed to the outside, and it was because the glass was not functioning as it should have been functioning, and you replaced it with a new glass. It goes back in my mind to one of the most famous work by Oscar Niemeyer in Lebanon, in fact, the World Fair, that was designed to be totally exposed. Until now, nobody is using it because we don't know how to use exposed space. So they took a small space of it, they closed it with a lot of walls to be able to do small fairs, and the very huge, one of the most beautiful architecture work done by Oscar Niemeyer. So in your work, in the film, that it's clear that there is a very vivid connection happening between the inside and the outside, and choosing to do a film with two actors in a closed space, in a modern house where the private and the public become in fact the modern architecture give a total different definition of what does it mean private and public. And if in the first scene the sound was affecting what was happening inside, in the second scene the spectator became, like the public became part of all of it. So I would like to hear more about this political decision of working on with modern architecture today, when it's clear that everywhere in the world we're failing in dealing with this richness of the heritage of modern architecture, and where we're always trying to close instead of opening to what's happening around us. So this is my comment question, and my question would be, I'm interested to know more about In the House, the film called The House. How did you work with the actors? Where did you decide to live there for a period while shooting, or was it just there for the shooting? And even with the cameras, were you like working with different kind of cameras, knowing that it's a closed space, and like for the depth and some logistics? I'm interested in some logistics and technicalities.
Yes, I mean, anyway, you say many interesting things, and I know you haven't seen the film, but yes, I sort of continue to be really interested in this subject and still very inspired. But first of all, my actors took me a long time to find, and they weren't actors. Neither of them had been in a film before, and they were subjected, really, as the only way of putting it, to a very intense period of shooting where I wanted them to live within the house, to experience it directly, like I said, so that it would become second nature to them. But actually, I myself had lived in the house during the sort of gestation, during the time of thinking about the ideas, and a lot of the ideas of sound, because sound is incredibly important to me, almost more than image in a way. The sounds of the house really struck me when I was living inside it, and I wanted to try and try and communicate those well, there's literally those sounds in the film, which was sort of actually more difficult than it sounds, because it's not a question of just recording a sound that you hear, it's how to sort of make it work cinematically. So the actors were completely like blank canvases in a way. They were very brave. They didn't really know much about the film. I didn't show them anything on paper. I had a kind of a screenplay for myself and some of my crew members, but they agreed to do it just based on a description of mine, and they took it day by day. So we shot in story order, which helped them a lot because it gave them a kind of well, not a map, because actually they didn't even have a map, but it meant that they could sort of map their own progress. So there was a kind of story literally happening for them anyway, sort of irrespective of everything else. So day by day, I knew Dee, the wife, already. She'd been a friend of mine for 25 years. I'll never cast a friend of mine again in a film, because it's quite damaging, really. I mean, it's not a good thing to do, to put a friend of yours in a film. And the husband, I had only met a few days before the shooting, so I was getting to know them both really in new ways during the film, and they were getting to know the house. There were so many layers to this, and I think I always construct my film so there's not only a film being made, but there's some kind of life being lived at the same time. Which ends up everyone feeling quite exhausted at the end of it, and actually I don't look at my films after I've made them, so it's quite strange to even watch these clips today. But I'm trying to think how else. I mean, maybe I answered your question, but there are many things to say about it. And actually, when you were describing the Oscar Niemeyer building and this idea of modernism sort of going to rack and ruin, it's crossed my mind, what would it have been like making this same film in the house before Matthias and Louisa adapted it? You know, what would it have been like with the Hessian walls there, and the thick pile carpet, and the windows that were clouded, rather like wearing glasses that you can't see through? You know, would that have made a more interesting film? Would it have made a less interesting film? Yes, it would have been a different film. You could make the same film maybe, but with the house, it would be a different character of house, a less sensual one maybe.
A question for both. I think that your extended takes and with the minimal camera movement are really interesting for cinema, and they are used usually for documentary. But now during these times, I think that the architecture should be showed in a different way, like more commercial with a fast cut. And so my question is, there could be a development about how the architecture could be shown, and how architecture and cinema could work more than just film.
It sounds really interesting. I'm not quite understanding what the question is.
it could be a development about how to show the architecture, not just in film but in a commercial way. How the frame and the takes could be maybe less extended.
Are you asking her how she would?
The question is for the architect. Yeah.
I mean, I personally think it's one. I mean, of course, it's very difficult if you haven't seen the full movie. But I mean, I think the first clip showed it very clearly. The way the camera is incredibly quiet and slow, and it's the extreme opposite of what you're suggesting, if I understand you rightly, of the kind of fast cut sort of, multiple things happening at the same time. It's very slow, but it lets you actually see the space. It lets you see the detail. It lets you see, the light. It lets you see everything about this house, and that's what makes this character or develops this character. This is how you start to understand the house, and I think it would be very, very difficult if it didn't have this incredibly beautiful camera work, which is very quiet in a way. So it would be a very different film. But maybe just one thing on the previous comments about filming modern architecture. I mean, I agree with you. I think there's a whole area that is neglected is maybe not the wrong word, but maybe doesn't have enough attention as it would deserve. And I think Antonioni is a very good association. I mean, I can see a certain familiarity there as well. I just think that, I mean, if you think of the cinema of the 50s, for example, architecture is always sort of set as a background of the kind of new times, the modern times, progress, the coldness of whatever relationships and so on. But I mean, the way Joanna shows this architecture in this film is very different from that. It's much more complex, and I think it would have been indeed a totally different film had you filmed the building as it used to be, because it would have been a sort of work of history in a way. I think now it's really the work of our generation. For me, it's really about this, having inherited this type of architecture, having inherited also, of course, the freedom and also the achievements that go with it, but somehow being challenged to, and loving it on one level, but also hating it. I mean, this is it's like a dream come true and a prison at the same time. And to somehow maneuver within that terrain, I think that is particular of this generation, and it's about the inheritance of modernism. I totally agree with what you're saying.
I mean, I was just going to say, picking up your mention of Le Mépris, I mean, that was a film that I did watch before I made Exhibition, and yes, I don't know if you can see the influence at all. I don't know if it rubbed off in any way, although at one point I wanted to call it A House Like Me, which is what the house Casa Malaparte was. Its kind of nickname. But yes, I really love that film. And in Godard's film, you can see the sort of wearing down of the architecture. You can see that it's not perfect, and I like that sort of lack of perfection. But yes, I think if as Matthias said, I think if I'd made the film in the previous incarnation of H House, it maybe would have come across as nostalgic or something. But what I feel inspired to do now is to sort of go beyond the real place, and actually maybe you need a bit more money, I think, but to actually build your place in a studio, so you're constructing it from the beginning, so that in that way architecture and film become incredibly connected, so you're making the architecture for the film.
Hello, I would like to ask, could you tell us something about the sound of the film, of the noise? Was it everything recorded on the set, or was it just post-production? And also it's a question for the architect. Have you thought about the soundscape or sound atmosphere in the house, in the way like, yeah, let's choose this kind of door. They are so annoying. Thank you.
I mean, the sounds of well, some I tried. I felt very. I had a sort of purist attitude to the sounds at first, and I thought, well, all the sounds must emanate from the house itself. And we did record a lot after we shot the film of extra sounds in the house. Inevitably, the sort of purism thing goes out of the window at a certain point because you're sort of constructing on another level. You're getting a sound that you think, or you think a sound is a certain way, but then you find it kind of works a different way, sort of in cinema. Anyway, it sort of became a very long process making all the sounds work, and yes, I mean I don't know what I don't know what to say about it other than it just sort of exists as it is. I mean I've been I'm working on a radio piece at the moment, and I'm really interested in how you can actually construct space just with sound. You know, you can know where you are from the sound of the footsteps, how much they echo, or it's sort of creating an imaginary space is something that's really interesting that I'm just discovering. I don't really feel I've answered your question properly, but it's a question of remembering. I find that there's this intense process that I described of making the film and then doing the post-production. In fact, the editor, Hella Lefebvre, is in the audience, and she's edited all my films, so she could probably answer to your question. But it's such an intense process, as maybe making films always is, that then there's a sort of process of forgetting afterwards, so it's sort of discarded. I feel the film, for me, is sort of kind of discarded. It's sort of no longer useful. It's like it's kind of an empty shell in some ways, and I find it hard to remember exactly what happened when or why I made a particular decision that I did, and I've moved on somewhere else.
But maybe as a kind of what's the word? Not totally objective viewer of your film, I would say that, I mean, in architecture space, you're perceiving your environment synesthetically, so basically all your senses are working at the same time, but one always thinks that the visual perception is the dominant one. You think you're seeing and you're judging by what you're seeing. So you think, well, this is a warm space, this is a comfortable space, this is a cold space, and so on, and you're trying to analyze, this is because of the color, or because of the proportion, or because of this, that, and the other. And actually, acoustics have an incredibly powerful effect on how you perceive the space, and most of the people are not really aware of it. So you can for architects, you can manipulate space through their acoustics incredibly strongly. I mean, you can make them sound comfortable because the echoes, obviously with electronic acoustics, you can virtually modulate the space as you wish. You can kind of make it a large, you even have it on your hi-fi set, it says large church or something, or it says comfortable theater or something. Like, you can choose your environment. And I think that's, again, for me, is what goes beyond the original building in Joanna's film, is that she kind of brings out, it's obvious that you understand, after a while, you understand that the acoustics are stronger than, the sound is stronger than normal, and it somehow brings out that level of perception, and you don't, at first you don't kind of understand why, but then you kind of slowly get it. And it makes you aware of the fact that the hearing is really part of the perception of your particularly the built environment. And yeah, I mean, again, it's telling about an aspect of architecture that you would possibly not be aware of if you just saw the piece, just the building.
And it's that Bresson thing of the ear is more creative than the eye, which I find is. I sort of believe that more and more.
This is a question for Joanna. I thought it was interesting when you said that the film maybe didn't have some of the warmth that you anticipated. And I was wondering how much that's tied into the camera, because when I watched the film, I almost felt like it was CCTV footage, because it was quite static. Occasionally there would be a pan, and often like shots repeated. And it was really interesting in a kind of voyeuristic way, but it was also, I think it had an effect of being quite dispassionate, which felt intentional. And I just wondered, if you had any thoughts on if there's a trade-off sometimes in cinema between certain aesthetic styles which get the audience to think and other styles which get them to feel.
I think it's a really good point, and I'm only learning that myself, that yes, keeping the camera still like that means that in a way you're kind of, the camera's not joining in, it's sort of not in sort of, it's trying not to be in the room in a sense. And I mean that the house is, talking of practicalities, it wasn't an easy house to shoot in. I mean, there's a big lift block in the center of the living space, which you can just see the corner of there. So you can't shoot across the room. There's certain angles that are very difficult. So to move the camera sort of within that situation as well. I mean, I think that can also become very self-conscious too. And I did move the camera more than I had in my previous films, but what happens, I find, if I move the camera too much, then the whatever I'm focusing on becomes, the camera becomes too much, self-conscious, and I'm not getting across those ideas that sometimes need duration to understand. So. Yes, maybe if I shot it again, I would shoot it the same way. I think there's another question, which is about the camera we shot on, which is the Alexa, which is what everyone is shooting their films on now. So in a way, there's very little discrepancy in terms of quality from one film to another. I think we're getting some kind of, it's unusual. I don't think there's been another time where everyone is shooting on exactly the same camera. And it's getting quite boring, I think, and it's making me question whether the next film I shoot on the Alexa or perversely shoot on film. I think if I'd shot this on celluloid, it would have had more of a warmth to it. Or even 16mm, actually, that would have really brought it to some other level.
My question is regarding the concept of feng shui, whether you were thinking about it and if you were, did you use it and did you work around it? And in the case you did you actually transmit it to your actors, or did you just place them in the house where you knew that there was an incredible energy? You were talking before about energy and architecture and space.
I don't think it was ever articulated as feng shui. I mean, there was a point a number of years ago where I was interested in this idea, and in fact I even had a consultation with somebody who does feng shui for somewhere I was living in with my husband, and this person came round to the place we were living in, and we sort of listened to what they had to say, but then maybe even 24 hours later discarded most of what they recommended because it didn't. I don't know. It's about your instincts, isn't it? It seemed too prescriptive, really. And actually, they said one or two things that have haunted me ever since about this particular space, because they sort of work on well, I mean, she was taught, this particular specialist, or whatever you call it, therapist almost, was sort of talking about ghosts and about certain areas where she suggested if you put flowers in that place, that will kind of calm that area down. And so it kind of it gave me these sort of haunted ideas, which I really didn't like at all. And also talked about sort of the not having edges, so everything has to be curved. So I don't really believe in it, but I do believe in spaces working or not working, and I think it's a kind of body thing, isn't it? You sort of feel whether something works, and I'm very sensitive to a space when if I arrive in a hotel room, like I arrived in a hotel room here and had some kind of slightly strange feelings about the room, and I thought, well, I could maybe find another room, but maybe I'll just stay here and kind of make it my own in some way.
Are these ideas that are just out of curiosity ever occur or are allowed to occur to an architect? Not necessarily feng shui, but the idea of animism or any kind of the soul of
Definitely. I mean, we're not practicing feng shui as such, just because it comes from a different culture, and I think it's not so easy to immediately step into and to really understand it. But I mean, what I do sense and believe is that objects or spaces acquire memory, and just like the city in a way acquires memory. And it's just a totally different, everybody knows this, I mean, it's totally different to move into a totally new apartment or move into an apartment where generations of people have been living. And it's not just that the surfaces are a little bit rougher and there's sort of lots of layers of paint on the windows and all of these things. There's some sort of energy, definitely. And I think to understand that energy, to kind of work with it and to somehow turn it into a positive energy is very much part of our work in a way. And I think in this particular building, as Joanna's described already, because it was built for two very particular people who had been living there for a large number of years, I mean, there definitely is the spirit of their previous inhabitation in the building, even though we totally, or not totally, but I mean, changed it considerably. Yeah.
There are more questions here. The next one here, then Roy again.
Joanna, I'm interested in Liam Gillick's input in the film. After all, it's one of the most important installation artists in the world through the German Pavilion and Documenta contributions. Looking at him staring or smiling at the sculpture, the taped nude sculpture, did you allow him to influence the work at all?
No. No, he was really great actually, because he's a very, very successful artist in his own right, and quite an unusual choice really well, the unusual thing was that he said yes and that he agreed to participate in the film, and he speaks about it now as a really sort of quite liberating process for him, where he sort of gave up any control. He knew that he didn't want to have any control over it in a way. He became kind of, using Bresson as a reference again, he became a model quite consciously. I gave him notes on cinematography to read, and he really took that to heart. And I think he'd already been thinking about cinema and what he saw as the kind of problem of cinema, and that how many artists were becoming directors, making films themselves, and he sort of thought on some level that wasn't that interesting, that it was more interesting to be kind of in a way an object in a film, to see it from another perspective. So he didn't he didn't have a script to go on, and he was just sometimes sleeping before we shot a scene. There was no preparation as such apart from living in the house for him to do. So he's also sort of seen it as another form of collaboration. But he sort of gave himself to the film in a very generous, very beautiful way, actually.
We have time for one last question. Oh, okay. Well, Roy has. Is it okay if I give the question to her because you already asked one? Okay.
John, in an interview you say the family need a location, not to lose a sense of oneself. So what about the city? Maybe can you tell me something more about how you feel the city, and maybe the collaboration with an architect change in some way your mind? Also not about just the city, but also the way to choose a frame.
I think I understand that correctly. I mean, so the house is within the city, and as well as the house being a starting point, it was also London that was a starting point, where a city that I've lived in since 1979, and this connects to your question. I mean, I at first sort of saw this house within the city, and that I would have many scenes in the city outside as well as in the house. And then I experienced, just before the shoot, a desire to only film within the house, not go outside at all. It was like a sort of fear, a bit like the fear of the character Dee, because she's a bit, what are you when you don't want to leave the house? She wanted to, she didn't want to. Agoraphobic. Thank you. She didn't. She was very frightened of the outside world, and I sort of experienced that almost through her eyes. And I thought, I'm going to cut all the scenes of the city, all the scenes outside of the house, and eventually I was persuaded by my fellow crew members who have become collaborators, very close collaborators over the years. They persuaded me that it was a good idea to keep those other scenes that I'd written, but there was something, there was something about not wanting to sort of dilute the kind of intensity of this house. It might have been very difficult to watch though, because it would have been very claustrophobic, I think. But it sounds like I'm very hard on myself, because there are things I would have done differently in the film. I think I also don't feel I depicted the city as well as I could have done, and maybe I depicted the house quite well, but my impressions of London, because I've lived there for so long, I think there's probably many more films about London, but I don't really feel this is a London film. It's inside a relationship. It's not really in a city somehow.
I would finally really like to destroy the house, or show how the film is being, how the house is being destroyed, in one last scene that you could watch as you're leaving. But I want to thank, first of all, the audience for coming. I want to thank Joanna Hogg for coming and answering, and Matthias Sauerbruch for coming and answering all these questions and sharing their knowledge, impressions, and emotions with us. Thank you very much. Yeah.